Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about positive mindset, the new findings showing the value of psychological capital. And something a little bit different than maybe what you're used to. So I'd like to begin my talks by briefly sharing some of my self-identities and positionalities. I do this in every presentation I do, whether it's to a small group, a large group, local, international, because I really believe that we all bring our full identities to the work that we do. And the way that I see it is awareness and self-reflection are essential for recognizing how our perspectives, our privileges, and our lived experiences shape our teaching, research, and practice. And I don't share this to center myself, but to model a practice that I feel is very important as a researcher, practitioner, and an educator, in that making aspects of our identities visible as a way to acknowledge that bias, although it's inevitable, that it's our responsibility to continually reflect on it and manage its influence in the work that we do. So this practice has shaped my work in psychology, in research and evaluation, and it frames how I'm going to approach today's conversation with you. So I'm going to start with this diagram, which you should all be familiar with from Dr. Donaldson's session couple months ago now. So in this session, he introduced the PERMA-4 framework as a framework for understanding these building blocks of well-being. So positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, plus physical health, environment, economic security, and mindset. One way to think about all these is that they're all resources that people can draw on, right? So research theories of well-being and conservation of resources theory remind us that when we build and protect these resources, our well-being increases. And when they're depleted, stress and burnout often follow. So for today, I want to highlight one of these building blocks, mindset, and explore some new research showing how psychological capital functions as a form of positive mindset. That's a lens that I'll use to connect well-being science with research that I've done in this space. Okay, so to start, I know one of you mentioned already that, or Dr. Ria, you mentioned that you've done this in your dissertation work, but for the rest of you, using your thumbs up emoji in your Zoom functions, who has heard of PsyCap? It looks like it looks like a couple of you. Okay, so if you're new to this psychological concept, you might think it's just another personality trait or another trait to be measured, maybe like extroversion or introversion. But hold on, I'll let you on a little secret. It's not. And that's what makes it such a valuable resource to develop. Before we get into what psychological capital is, it's helpful to understand how it builds on more traditional forms of capital that organizations have long considered valuable. So we usually think of economic capital, and these are the things that you have. So your physical resources like money, buildings, equipment, or data. And this form of capital is tangible. It's often tracked like on our balance. Next, we have human capital, which is also about what you have, but this is in terms of your knowledge, your skills, your experience, your education. It's your intellectual capacity and your job-related competencies. So all those skills that you bring to your workplace. And then there's social capital. And this has gotten very familiar in the last couple of decades as teaming and team dynamics and organizations has become a very popular, marketable capacity to have. So this is about who you know. It refers to relationships, trust, networks, your ability to access resources or support through those connections. And these forms of capital, economic, human, and social, these are very well established in the literature, primarily in organizational psychology, organizational behavior. But as Luthans and colleagues point out, they aren't enough. So in today's fast-changing, high-demand work environments, we also need to focus on who you are. And that's where psychological capital comes in. So PsyCap are the resources that make up who you are, or more importantly, who you are becoming. And positive psychological capital, or PsyCap, is one of the most widely researched and well-supported positive psychological constructs and interventions in the field of positive psychology. It's often referred to as the core construct of positive organizational behavior. And this idea was first introduced by Fred Luthans in 2002, when he argued that for organizations to truly thrive and grow, they needed to shift attention away from only technical or educational development and toward the psychological development of their people. So Luthan's central position was that the workforce itself is the ultimate competitive advantage. And unlike financial or technical resources, which can be copied or bought, psychological strengths of employees, what he referred to as PsyCap, are far more difficult for competitors to imitate. So that's what makes PsyCap such a valuable resource for individual and organizational success. Over the years, however, PsyCap has become much more than an organizational psychological resource. It is now expanded into so many other domains in different professions as both an individual and an organizational developmental construct. So this slide here gives us a quick overview of those four capacities that make up psychological capital. So hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And these nicely make up that word hero, which is very apt for construct. These capacities are grounded in strong theory and decades of research, but what's more powerful is how they work together. So there's a growing body of evidence that shows that when combined, they operate synergistically to produce a range of positive outcomes, from strong performance at work to greater personal well-being. And in the next few slides, I'm going to unpack each of these dimensions individually so that we could see how they function both on their own and then as part of the larger PsyCap framework. Okay, so we're going to start with the dimension of hope. So when we talk about hope in the context of psychological capital, we're not just talking about hope as an emotion or a vague sense of wishing things will turn out well. So we all use the word hope in our everyday language, right? I really hope that I make it to work on time, given the high traffic today. Or I really hope this session ends on time so I can go about getting all the other things that I have to do with my day. But in PsyCap, hope is conceptualized a little bit differently. It's conceptualized as this positive motivational state that can actually be developed and measured. And it has these two essential components. So first, urgency, and the goal-directed energy and determination to keep moving forward. And secondly, and most importantly, are pathways. So this is the ability to identify multiple routes to reach a goal. And these two processes are inseparable, but they're also additive with each other. So the more clearly you can see pathways to achieve your goal, the more agency you feel, and then vice versa. Together, they create higher levels of hopeful thinking. What makes this especially powerful is that hope, while sometimes thought of as only an emotion, right? Like the example that I gave, I hope that this happens today. It's also a state-like capacity, which means that it can be strengthened through practice. And research has shown that higher levels of hope are linked to things like stronger work performance and even organizational.
देखो नो इंटरनेट आ गया फिर से
So a practical way to
इंटरनेट भी नहीं है
hope is goal setting exercises, which we're going to experience a little bit later. So by setting clear, specific goals and identifying multiple pathways to reach them, we actively cultivate hope as a psychological resource. So now the next element in our hero framework. In PsyCap, efficacy refers to a person's belief in their ability to mobilize motivation, cognitive resources, and action to accomplish a specific task within a given context. What's important to note is that self-efficacy is not so much about the skills that you have, but it's about your judgment of what you can do with the skills that you already possess. So that's really what sets it apart, right? It's this belief in your capacity to apply abilities that you already have effectively, which is really cool because it's not about trying to go out and build new capacities or new skills, but really just kind of reframing this focus on knowing that the skills that you have, that you can apply them effectively. It's also distinct from self-esteem, where self-esteem is more about how you feel about yourself more broadly. Self-efficacy is about confidence in your ability to take on a specific challenge and put in the effort that's going to require you to see it all the way through. Efficacy influences almost everything that we do. So our choices, the goals that we set, how much effort we invest into our work, how we cope with setbacks, whether we persist when things get tough. If you think about it, it's really efficacy that's driving a lot of dealing with those situations. And like other PsyCap dimensions, it is also state-like, meaning it can be developed through intentional activities. So one proven approach is cognitive framing activities paired with goal setting. So these help individuals reframe challenges, recall past mastery experiences, and build the confidence needed to persist in future tasks. Now moving on to the R of our hero acronym is resilience. So resilience is a word that we're very common with. We use it all the time, and we usually use it when we witness or observe someone overcome an obstacle or challenge. And resilience in PsyCap is very similar. So it's about this ability to adapt well when facing adversity, whether that's trauma, setbacks, threats, or even in the ordinary stressors that build up in your everyday life. Earlier on in the research on resilience, it was thought to be an inherited trait, right? Something only a few people were born with. And that assumption led researchers to study it from psychological, psychosocial, and biological perspectives, asking that very important question of why do some individuals recover from adverse events while others don't? What we now know is that resilience is not rare or extraordinary. It arises from ordinary processes. And as Anne Maston, who's one of the leading researchers in this area, has described, it's that ordinary magic of everyday human strengths and resources that make recovery and growth possible. And resilience also exists on a spectrum. So where some aspects of it are trait-like, right? You all know or have heard a story of that child who's just overcome some adversity and still thrives. However, it's also highly state dependent and context specific, which is very important for PsyCap because it can be developed and strengthened in different situations. So at work, resilience has been linked to career success and organizational resilience. And because resilient individuals not only bounce back themselves, but they also have the ability to contribute toward collective recovery, which is very cool. It's a very kind of contagious effect when you demonstrate resilience. A practical way to build resilience is through rapport building and socialization opportunities. So we all know that supportive relationships, mentorship, and trust within our teams can really create conditions for us to adapt, recover, and even grow through challenges. And then the last word or the last letter refers to optimism. And this one is my favorite. Because this is not just thinking positively, right? We all know that optimistic person that just walks around and just thinks happily about things that are to come. And that's important. That's fantastic. It's a wonderful trait to have. But optimism in PsyCap is about our ability to explain events to ourselves. So optimism involves the attributions that we make for why things happen, especially when it comes to things like setbacks. So there are two dimensions that are super important to optimism, and that's permanence and pervasiveness. So permanence, it's about how long we think the effects will last, and pervasiveness is about how broadly we think those effects will carry on to other areas of our life. So optimistic individuals, they tend to view negative events as temporary and specific. They believe challenges won't last forever, and they don't think that they will define their entire lives. In contrast, pessimists are more likely to see them as permanent and all-encompassing. So this attributional style helps optimists stay motivated, build stronger relationships, and invest more effort into managing those relationships. It also contributes to broader social support networks and resilience in the face of adversity. And like other PsyCap dimensions, optimism is also both trait-like and state-like. So yes, there are those people that are just inherently happy and optimistic. However, the state-like component of it means that it can be developed. And one effective intervention is a best self-activation exercise. So these exercises encourage people to visualize and plan around their most positive possible future. This reinforces the belief that success and growth are within reach from a little bit of work. So PsyCap is considered this higher order construct. And what that means is that it's stronger than the sum of its individual parts. So when all elements of hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism are developed together, they work in synergy. And this creates benefits that are greater than what each resource can provide on its own. And individuals that are high in PsyCap, they can draw on these resources as needed. And through this process, they expand their capacity over time. So this aligns with Barbara Fredrickson's brought it and built theory, if you're familiar with that theory, in which she states that the more often people use these psychological resources and experience the benefits of them, the more likely they are to broaden and continue developing them. And so what makes PsyCap especially valuable is that it's state-like, right? And unlike traits such as intelligence, talent, or even personality, which are relatively fixed over time, PsyCap can be intentionally developed and strengthened. And unlike fleeting states such as moods or emotions, which are really just too fleeting to be sustained, PsyCap is enduring enough to influence outcomes in meaningful, sustainable ways. So in practice, PsyCap can be both powerful, but it could also be practical. It can grow, it could be trained, and it could be leveraged as a renewable psychological resource. So this diagram shows how PsyCap functions. On the left are the antecedents, things like demographics, personality, characteristics, organizational climate, and leadership. These are all things that are going to affect PsyCap. At the center are the four capacities of PsyCap, right? Those ones that we just went through, working together as this higher order construct. And then on the right, you see outcomes.
गुड मॉर्निंग सर, कैसे हैं आप?
We'll detail each
सर
of these.
वो बाकी एक्सपर्ट्स
So research has consistently showed that PsyCap predicts productivity, work attitudes, behaviors, health, relationships, and overall well-being. PsyCap is also shaped by personal and organizational factors, and research shows that it consistently predicts positive outcomes like performance, well-being, and relationships. And because it's state-like, it can be intentionally developed. So looking at the research evidence, the list of PsyCap outcomes is very impressive. Studies across nearly 2 decades show that higher PsyCap is associated with not just job performance and job satisfaction, but also organizational commitment, engagement, organizational citizenship behavior, which are those discretionary, like pro-social behaviors that keep workplaces running optimally, lower absenteeism, lower stress, as well as fewer intentions to quit at work, higher subjective well-being, and then more recent studies confirm positive links to work engagement and negative associations with things like burnout. Meta-analysis of hundreds of studies now confirm that it's one of the most robust predictors of individual and organizational outcomes. And across hundreds of studies, it's been linked to higher performance, satisfaction, engagement, and well-being. And then most importantly, and also lowering stress and burnout and turnover. So at the time that I was learning about psychological capital, much of the research on positive organizational psychology and PsyCap especially had been focused on weird nations. What we mean by weird nations is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic nations. And so there was a lot of questions raised about whether PsyCap might hold the same predictive value globally. So in 2018, a few colleagues and we set out to test whether PsyCap predicts at a measure of work role performance across a diverse range of cultural contexts. So we collected data from over 3,800 employees across 15 countries to see if PsyCap consistently predicted 3 key work behaviors. And these behaviors were adaptivity, so adjusting effectively to change, proactivity, which means taking initiative, and then proficiency measured as performing your core job tasks well. Together, these capture a comprehensive view of what we described as work role performance. So our central question was, is PsyCap a universal psychological resource for thriving at work, no matter where you are in the world? Granted, we couldn't include every single country in the world, but we did our best to try to get a representative sample of both weird and non-weird countries. And this was our sample. So after data cleaning, our final sample included 3,614 employees across 15 countries, including Brazil, China, South Africa, the US, and Germany. And I'm sure you've seen that India is also represented here. We worked with Qualtrics we worked with Qualtrics panels, and we stratified to ensure that the demographics were representative of the working population in each country. In terms of education, our sample reflected a wide range of attainment. So about 8% had a high school diploma or equivalent, 15% had an associate degree or equivalent, just over half had a bachelor's degree or equivalent, about 20% had a master's or equivalent, and nearly 4% held a doctorate degree or equivalent. So overall, this was a large, diverse, and representative sample that gave us confidence in the generalizability of our findings. So this is a diagram of our hypotheses. And we simply predicted what we had seen in the research of PsyCap in organizational settings, that PsyCap would predict high adaptivity, proactivity, proficiency, and then when combining all three dimensions of work metrics together, that it would predict high overall work performance. To measure this, we use the PCQ, which is the validated questionnaire for PsyCap that's been validated in almost every language across many countries. We also use this 27-item work role performance scale that's also been validated in many organizations. And we controlled for things like age, gender, education, and we did predictive and data analyses. Okay, this table shows the zero-order correlations between PsyCap and our work role performance outcomes across 15 countries. And what we see here is a consistent pattern. PsyCap strongly and significantly was correlated with adaptivity, proactivity, proficiency, and overall performance in every country. So in other words, regardless of the context, whether it was a weird or non-weird nation, higher PsyCap was reliably associated with better work outcomes. This gave us the green light to move forward with analyses to look at this predictive relationship between PsyCap and performance. And here we see those results, which show the percent of variance in job performance explained by PsyCap in 15 countries. Across the board, PsyCap significantly predicted all three of the individual work performance dimensions and then the overall performance composite. Control variables like age, gender, and education, they had minimal influence. And importantly, there was no moderating effect of country. So in other words, the results were culturally consistent. Belonging to one country or another had no impact on the results. So to put it simply, the more of the hero capacities that you had, the better the individuals perform at work. For example, in Japan, PsyCap explains about 70% of the variation in overall performance score. So you can assume that knowing someone's PsyCap level might give you insight into how strong of a work performer they are. These results were strong and consistent across 15 countries, again, including both weird and non-weird contexts. And so this demonstrated further findings of PsyCap as a robust predictor, but also a robust cross-culturally relevant predictor for workplace performance. Now, as good researchers, it's always good to point out the strengths and limitations of the study. So one key strength of the study is definitely its scope. With more than 3,600 participants, it stands as one of the most comprehensive cross-national examinations of PsyCap. We also used validated measures and consistent methodology, and that allowed us to make meaningful cross-country comparisons. But of course, there are limitations, right? The data we collected was through online panel recruitment, which means they may not fully represent all working populations. And the design was cross-sectional, which means we can't speak to causality over time. That said, the consistency of the results across this country reinforces PsyCap's value as a reliable and adaptable psychological resource. And I'll add that there has been a ton of research since then that has replicated these findings and has actually now demonstrated durable effects across time. Still, with these caveats in mind, I wanted to turn what these findings might mean in practice and how PsyCap can be applied globally. So what these results tell us is that PsyCap is not only a strong predictor of performance, but it's also globally applicable. So that means we can feel confident in applying PsyCap-based practices in diverse cultural contexts. It also reinforces the potential for human resources of international companies or global companies and organizational development professionals to use PsyCap as a foundation, perhaps for inclusive, strengths-based approaches to workforce development. So the big takeaway is, PsyCap, it continues to offer practical evidence-based resource for building performance and well-being across cultures at work. But building on this cross-cultural evidence, I wanted to see whether PsyCap could do more than predict performance and well-being. Specifically, at the time that I was getting ready to design my next research study, I was very interested to know whether it could also support those that work in the fields of evaluation, or you might think of it as like applied research, who are engaged in the demanding work of advancing social justice, because this is another area that was very important to me. I'm going to share now some of my most recent research that I completed in 2023 that I continue to work on even today. So we saw in that cross-cultural study that PsyCap, it did reliably predict work role performance across 15 countries. These were great findings. It was very exciting to publish this in an article and to present it at conferences. It was very well received. But the robustness did raise a next question for me. The literature that I mentioned earlier when we were looking at those outcomes, it also links PsyCap to pro-social behaviors, which I really care about. So these were things like organizational citizenship, right? Trust in teams. And so I began to wonder, can PsyCap do more than just
कोविल इनको थोड़ा क्लास ले लो जरा
and
थोड़ा
well-being?
डिस्कशन करना चाह रही है बच्ची
Or than just boost performance and well-being. Specifically, I wanted to know if it could help applied practitioners or evaluators sustain their work in social justice. So I started this work, I think it would be helpful to frame for you, in 2020. And you all remember where the world was in 2020. Specifically in the United States, this was a time of deep polarization and misinformation. Unfortunately, we still find ourselves in a similar state today. But at this time, as you remember, in addition to that, we had a global pandemic where science was so important as we were trying to develop therapies around the global pandemic. In addition, there was these high rates of civil unrest due to things like systemic inequity. So when science and science practitioners were under a microscope, many practitioners felt very stretched thin. And so my motivation with this study was practical. If PsyCap is a developable resource, could it help fuel motivation and follow through for those working towards social betterment, for those trying to do good for the world? So this study tests that idea by examining whether the hero capacities predict engagement in social justice practices, not just job performance. And in short, does PsyCap help applied practitioners move from values to action in the real constraints of our current contexts? So just to frame a little bit of my motivations for the study, in recent years, we have seen a paradigm shift. Those of us that work in applied research and evaluation, where social justice, equity, and ethics, they're no longer peripheral, but these are now central capacities and such central competencies for us to have. So practitioners recognizing the importance of addressing systemic issues like racism and inequity, and adopting more culturally responsive approaches. So at the same time, emerging practitioners were expected to do more than just demonstrate strong technical scientific skills, right? We also now need to bring interpersonal, contextual, and reflective capacities. And they need clear standards for what social justice might look like in action. So that's part of why I set out to operationalize these standards and explore how they might connect to constructs like PsyCap. So here, PsyCap may play an important role. It has the potential to serve as a psychological resource that can buffer against the challenges that practitioners face when trying to do social good. But we still needed more research to understand how PsyCap might contribute to sustainable, high-quality social justice practice. There had been none. And how it might influence other outcomes and interventions for applied researchers. So this figure shows the hypothesis I used to guide the study. So I tested whether PsyCap predicted work world performance outcomes, just like we did in the previous study. Important to continue replicating the work that you've done, especially when you're doing a new context with new samples. So I wanted to replicate that research, but I also extended the model to look at whether PsyCap predicted engagement in social justice practices. So things like reflection, relational practices, and action activist-oriented practices. I also considered whether years of experience might strengthen or weaken these relationships, essentially testing if more seasoned practitioners drew on PsyCap differently than those newer to the field. To do this, I first needed to operationalize what do we mean by social justice practice, right? It's a very common term, but up until the time that I ran this study had not been fully operationalized, and there was no measure around being able to measure what this looks like in practice. So I had to walk through creating one. So I'm going to briefly go through the first study in which I did just that, just so you understand how I made these connections. So to study that relationship between PsyCap and justice, I first needed to operationalize what this looked like in practice. So through qualitative work and a review of the literature, I developed a measure that identifies these three interrelated domains. Reflection and learning is one domain that the behaviors in this domain are ongoing self-reflection on bias, positionality, privilege, and continual growth. And then there's a relational domain, and these are behaviors around how we engage with others, how we build trust, how we share power in our partnerships in the work that we do, and then action. So these are the concrete steps that we create, that design and implement, and use our practice in ways that promote justice and equity. So together, these three domains capture a fuller picture of what it means to engage in social justice practice. And just quickly, I'll share a couple of examples of what each of these items look like. So in total, the measure was 35 items. And the reflective and learning practice included items like creating space for uncomfortable conversations about justice, reflecting on identity, values, and mental models, checking for bias and privilege in the work. So these behaviors acknowledge that ongoing self-awareness and willingness to grow, not just technical skill. And then the second domain on relational practice, this had the most items in it. And this involved things like active listening and building trust with your partners of the community, adapting data collection tools for cultural relevance, cultivating bidirectional learning between evaluators and interest holders, and sharing power with marginalized voices. So these relational practices emphasize that our practice is people-centered, and justice is pursued in how we engage with others and not just in the end product. And then lastly, this third domain is what we actually do, right, in the practice to embed justice. So these are things like asking questions that adjust systemic drivers of inequity, aligning our budgeting time and resources for collective reflection, and then diversifying our teams. So these are so that they are representative. These are the concrete structural decisions that move social justice from intention to practice. So this is a sample for that study, a much smaller sample than the earlier one that I ran, because this was a study of actual practitioners, so those who were actually doing the work. Applied practitioners, many of whom were evaluators or applied psychologists, representing a wide range of experiences, training backgrounds, positions, and approaches. This was a very difficult sample to get because, as you imagine, these folks that are doing social justice work are they're quite busy and overburdened. A lot of them have work that they do that's not budgeted in their contracts, but they do them for the good, of the work. And they're a very difficult population to recruit, but it was so important to do this study with that sample to see really what PsyCap looks like in an applied context like this. In terms of experience, nearly 60% though had less than 10 years of experience. So as you could see, I tended to capture more of like the emerging practitioners rather than many who had been seasoned in the field. And this kind of comes up later in the findings. For training though, I had a more balanced training sample. So 38% doctoral level preparation, 31% master's level preparation, and then others reporting non-degree or no formal training. Okay, a quick scan of the bivariate story. So the means and the standard deviations showed good spread, which meant that we had a good sample to work with, albeit smaller than I would have hoped. The correlations line up with expectations. So PsyCap is moderately related to social justice action and social justice relational, but not related to social justice reflection behaviors. PsyCap also shows robust positive links with all three of those work role performance indicators from the previous study. So nice to kind of uphold and replicate some of that research here. Years of experience and applied training have small to moderate associations with PsyCap and some outcomes. So we control for them in the next models. And remember, these are associations only. So the next thing that I did was run regressions to test this unique prediction. Looking at the regression models, just for the sake of time, I didn't include all the models here, but PsyCap emerged as a reliable predictor of work performance again. So those were hypotheses were upheld, even after accounting for years of experience and training. So this just reinforced what we had seen before in the previous research in that individuals that are high in PsyCap consistently perform better in their day-to-day roles, even with this sample. And in this sample for social justice practices, the findings were a bit more nuanced. So PsyCap was a significant predictor of action-oriented practices, meaning those with higher PsyCap are more likely to take concrete steps towards justice in their work, which was fantastic findings to see. But I did find partial support for relational practices. So those effects were a bit smaller. This is likely reflecting the complexity of power sharing and cultural competence. And these often require time to develop. So maybe some mentoring is also required and also like lived experience. As you remember, I had a slightly skewed younger sample. And then PsyCap was not a significant predictor of reflective practices. And so if you think about what PsyCap is, a lot of it, especially a lot of the exercises to build it, are based in reflection. So reflection may rely more heavily on other psychological or contextual drivers. And then one thing to note here, like I mentioned about the sample, is it did skew toward younger and emerging practitioners. So some of these relational reflective practices may require that confidence that's built up with years of practice. So taken together, these findings suggest PsyCap plays a meaningful role in action and performance, and then its relationship to relational reflective justice practices need additional research. So one of the key strengths of this study is its scope and focus. It is literally the first study to explicitly examine a relationship between any positive psychological constructs and social justice practitioners, to my knowledge. And then certainly the first for PsyCap, of course. It used carefully developed measure to operationalize those practices, and then I used the validated measure to measure work role performance. Another strength that it extends the PsyCap literature beyond performance and well-being. So I'm testing its relevance in an applied social justice context, which was very important to me. That said, there were some important limitations. So first, like I mentioned, the sample size was not super well distributed when it came to years of experience. And that might help the reason why it did not significantly predict relational practices and perhaps even a reflective. Secondly, the data were cross-sectional, as with the first study, which means we can't draw conclusions about causality. But to build on this work, I'm really excited because I've just launched a study in collaboration with the VIA Institute on Character to replicate some of these findings with a much larger sample. So I'm not only going to test the PsyCap relationships again, but I'm also exploring what character strengths are most strongly connected to justice practice and to PsyCap itself. So this is going to help us better understand the interplay of psychological resources and personal strengths in sustaining equity-focused work. These findings highlight three main implications. So first, PsyCap's relationship with social justice practices is mixed. It clearly predicted action-oriented practices, and then the connection was a bit weaker for relational and not significant for reflection. There might be some directionality issues with reflection. It's possible that engaging in reflection builds PsyCap rather than PsyCap driving reflection. So this is something that I'm going to be including in the research that I'm doing right now with VIA. And then finally, the study replicated PsyCap's strong relationship with work role performance, which is great to reinforce just how consistent this construct is across different professional contexts. So what does this mean in practice? So these studies, both of them suggest that developing psychological resources like PsyCap can be especially beneficial when dealing with high job demands and the pressures of equity-focused work. Importantly, what's really important is that it can be built through accessible positive psychology interventions. So we think of these as PPIs, right? And these aren't complicated. They include practices that many of us are already familiar with, like goal setting, planning, and structured reflection. And because they're simple and practical, PPIs can enhance the practice of both emerging and seasoned practitioners. So this helps us to sustain motivation, build resilience, and strengthen our equity focus and practice over time. So the takeaway here is that this is not just a research construct, but it is very much a practical tool that any type of practitioner or worker, no matter the job function or the position or the organization, can use to improve, to promote inclusive strengths-based development. And because it can be strengthened through everyday practices, I want to give you a chance to try one out. So I'm going to walk you through a brief SMART goal setting exercise. I'm going to introduce a PPI to you so that you can see how accessible it is to start building hope and efficacy, and then the other dimensions right away. So if you can locate a pen and something to write with, or open up a document on your computer. I can give you a minute to do that while I frame this exercise. So we've been talking about PsyCap as both research and practice, but I want to shift now for us to think about a micro intervention so you can experience it for yourself. One of the best things about PsyCap, like I said, is it's practical to develop. And we can strengthen it through short intentional activities. So goal setting is one of the simplest and most effective ways to build these dimensions of hero, particularly in specific areas. So we're going to work through a SMART goal exercise together. We won't be able to finish it, but we'll be able to start it. So I'm going to give you the tools to do this. Okay. So we're going to walk through the early steps of creating a SMART goal. I'm sure most of you are familiar with SMART goals, but if not, this is a goal that is specific, measurable, achievable, that means it can be accomplished, relevant, and time-bound. So I want you to set one SMART goal that you want to achieve in the last 3.5 months of the year. If you can believe it, we only have 3.5 months left of this year. So it doesn't have to be huge. It just needs to be specific and meaningful to you. Write it down in SMART format and make sure that it's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And as you do that, the process of creating that goal plan already starts to build hope, because what you're going to do is that you're going to create a plan to achieve this goal. So after you write your goal down, you're going to take a moment to map out how you will achieve this goal by breaking it into clear steps. So this is where Hope's pathways thinking comes in. You're going to identify multiple routes to get to where you want to go. And I find that it's always helpful to start backwards. So maybe you start in December and you work your way backwards. So December is you've achieved the goal. What are the things that you have to do to achieve the goal? Working backwards to now. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that because I want to be sensitive of your time. Okay. It's fine if you don't finish. You can make note of it and you can finish after the session or sometime this week. Okay, so next we're going to focus on resilience, right? This ability to bounce back from adversity and challenges. And part of it is you have to go through those challenges, but you can also start to build it by thinking about them, by planning for them. So every meaningful goal comes with challenges, no matter how small or big it is. I want you to write down at least one obstacle that you might encounter and how you could work around it. And building this awareness ahead of time will strengthen your resilience when you come to face it. So this could be one potential obstacle or barrier that you might encounter. And we could think of this as a contingency plan. And if you don't have this fully fleshed out in the next minute, that's completely fine. You could continue to think through it after the session or sometime this week. And if you recall, another way to build resources is to identify and develop tools that are going to help you navigate that challenge. And one example of doing this is social support. So now I want you to think about the person that you're going to lean on for encouragement or accountability. So this could be a colleague, a mentor, or a friend. It could be someone at home or someone at work, but someone that's really going to keep you accountable to doing this goal. Social support is one of the strongest predictors of follow through. So you might think of this as an accountability partner or a change partner. Okay. Now we're going to touch on optimism, right? So remember the attribution. So expecting you will succeed now and in the future. And with optimism, one way to do this is to find ways to celebrate small wins. Identifying ways to celebrate progress as you go. So obviously you're not going to have those wins just yet because you're just writing them down. But as you do start to accomplish each of those tasks towards your goal, you really want to make sure that you acknowledge and that you celebrate those, because even small wins can reinforce your motivation and your confidence. And this builds self-efficacy, but also builds this optimism about your ability to succeed. And we know from self-efficacy that this is the confidence to succeed at a specific task. And there are a number of ways that you can do this in addition to celebrating your small wins. So Albert Bandura has done a lot of research in this area. And the first is through mastery experiences. So succeeding at something, especially if it's challenging, it can reinforce the belief that we can do it again. The second is vicarious learning. So seeing someone like us succeed at a task is so important. When we observe others similar to us or similar to ourselves overcome obstacles, we start to believe that we can do the same. And so also it's very important for you to also demonstrate for your community and your peers that when you succeed, they might also feel like they can succeed. And then the third is encouragement. So supportive feedback from mentors, peers, or leaders can strengthen our belief in our abilities, especially when it's specific and grounded in evidence of our strengths. And then finally, going back to one of the building blocks of positive emotions is positive states. So how we feel physically and emotionally shapes our confidence. It just does. When we are rested, regulated, and emotionally balanced, we're more likely to believe that we can perform well. So trying to put yourself in a positive state is so important to performing well. Keep these in mind as you continue to work on your goal throughout the next few months. And together, these strategies show that self-efficacy is not just a fixed thing, and it can be intentionally developed. So this was a SMART goal process that you can take along with you. It's one of many positive psychology interventions, but you'll notice how each step builds hero capacities, right? That goal clarity and pathways build hope, planning in small wins builds efficacy, anticipating barriers builds resilience, and celebrating successes fosters optimism. So keep practicing this cycle, even in small ways, and you will strengthen your PsyCap. And then it will make it easier for you to stay motivated and to adapt and to sustain performance in high demand roles, which ultimately will lead to greater happiness and life satisfaction. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that you connect with me either through email or through LinkedIn. And with that, I'll invite your questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the very insightful session. I'm sure we have some questions here, and I think I'm receiving a lot of applause, so that's a great sign.
Thank
And
you.
so we are open to questions now.
Hi, this is Srihari, and today being the World Suicide Prevention Day, all I wanted to figure out from you as a researcher is there any study which was conducted to figure out that person with very low level of PsyCap are more vulnerable for committing suicide or attempting suicide?
There is research to demonstrate that low levels of PsyCap are associated with things like lower life satisfaction and burnout, even like mood disorders like depression. I haven't seen any data on suicide rates.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah,
Yes.
Riya, it's okay. Can I ask the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Hello, Jennifer. Great, very great session and lots of things. And I've kept on writing a lot of stuff. My question to you is that how do we help or what interventions can we suggest to a person who is, facing multiple failures? So, for example, this is where your psychological capital is on the most negative, lowest. So, I think it comes from what Dr. Srihari was also asking. Like for people who are already there in the negative zone, what are those small interventions, like you mentioned, hero, that they can do? Because right now they are not feeling enough to, set up their own goals or to even think positively. So, what are those interventions that we can give them?
Sure. So there are a ton of different small interventions that can be done to build PsyCap. I just want to make sure that I preface it with that if there is someone that is very struggling emotionally, psychologically, positive psychological interventions are not therapy, right? So it's not the equivalent. And that's always going to be something that's important information to share. But for someone who's like just struggling at work, they're not happy at work, or they haven't met their goals and they're feeling stuck, these types of life situations, positive psychology interventions, especially PsyCap ones, are really fantastic for that, because there's a number of different things that you could do. So one of them is what I shared you, right? Goal setting, but goal setting done properly, it can be very effective. And not just writing it down and forgetting about it, but actually, doing it methodically and getting someone to hold you accountable. There's also, like I mentioned in each of those slides, a couple of things you can do. There's some reflective opportunities or reflective activities where you're just reframing some of the different experiences that you had. So taking your everyday stressors or events and trying to trying to cognitively reframe them. And then pairing that then with a goal, right? Pairing that with something that you can do. So it's not just thinking about how you can think about things differently, but now attaching it to something that you can do differently. So, I'm struggling to meet up with my demands at work. Okay, maybe I can have conversations with my employers, and maybe I can work with my team to distribute that work amongst more individuals at work so that I can focus more on doing my job well. And let me set some time bounds around this. What are some ways that I can like actively decrease that work? Other things that you could do are, interventions based on reflection. So imagining your most positive future self. Some of these kind of like gratitude focus exercises can be really helpful for that reframing to happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Admin, I think you have your hand up.
Professor Nitin, please go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you, Dr. Ria and Dr. Jennifer. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. And I was listening very, should I say, cautiously to every word that you were saying. And Dr. Rekhi sir, first of all, thank you for arranging such beautiful lectures so that we can connect with everybody. Jennifer ma'am, I was just thinking of two questions. Number one, since you are talking about this resilience and optimism, so can we address in the same manner the same interventions like for the college students or for the workforce, means different age gaps? Does the same intervention works at different age gaps, or it is like specifically for one it works? My first question.
Yeah, so a lot of the research that has been done, the research that I did, but also research that has been published, age does not have a huge factor. It's not, it doesn't play a huge role in differing effects of the interventions. Just some are more accessible or more relevant, right? So if you're going to build PsyCap in school-age children, you obviously can't do kind of work-oriented goals. You would kind of adapt those to kind of school-based goals, or the reflective activities would look a little bit differently. But no, PsyCap has now actually been, it's something I didn't even mention. It's been studied a lot in school-age children and showing promising and similar effects.
So who is able to receive more, young people or the elderly people, to become psychologically more mature, or they can be more resilient? Who is more first choice preference absorption?
I mean, children are always easier to develop, right? Because they're just more open. Openness to change is also very important in development.
Okay. And the second question is like for entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, those who are in just late 20s or early 20s, because in India we have a startup movement going at very big level. So even the college students are entering in our university for startups. So they are fearing little backlash of rejections, even from the family support, even from sometimes those who can't understand their ideas, even their faculty or the colleagues, they feel isolated. So sometimes they want to give up the idea. And so is there any tool, any method, or any something formula you want to give to us that we can share to them, and we can build up their momentum, or you can say optimism, as you say?
I mean, in resilience, as you saw in the intervention, socialization and social support, even if you're practicing all the different individual interventions, are so important, right? Having a community, having social support is really, really important in developing resilience. And
Okay.
having the opportunity to see successes in your peers as well is important, but in a way that feels like you have the confidence and the ability to complete them as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ria, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, may I ask a question?
Please.
Thank you, Jennifer ma'am, and thank you, Reiki Foundation, for organizing the entire series, and thank you, CGU. The most interesting part for me was your research, what you have done, and how you have, related psychological capital with social justice practices. So you mentioned a directionality issue between the relational part and the social and the PsyCap. There was a directionality issue, so the results were not significant. Similar problem I faced in one of my research where procedural justice and distributive justice was not significantly related with workplace well-being. So, ma'am, my question is how we can address this directionality issue in our research? Because the reviewers, they tell us that you have hypothesized, but your relationships are not significant.
Yeah, so the directionality comment that I made, that was with reflection, like reflective
Yeah.
activity.
Yes.
And yeah, so that I need to do the research again, and I'm currently conducting a study with VIA, and that's one of the research questions that I had for that study to look to see, because it's just my assumption, right? It could very well be that they're not related, but if you think about all of the interventions that I described in PsyCap, most of them require reflection. They require reflective activity.
True.
Even build PsyCap, you need to engage in those behaviors. Now, the reflection in social justice and then the reflection to build PsyCap are different behaviors, but they require the same cognitive resources, right? And so what I think is that those reflection activities, because they're so integral to building PsyCap, that's why it'd be helpful. It'd be difficult for it to predict,
Yeah.
other reflective behaviors.
So, ma'am,
Assumption.
yeah. So, do you think that any experiment would, can overcome this directionality issue if we design a small experiment?
Yeah, I mean, that's the most desirable type of research, right? Is to do the experiment. For this study that I'm doing now, it's not an experiment, it's still cross-sectional research. But I actually am applying for some funding, so hopefully I can get that to do more work in this area.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.